Thank you all very much for coming this morning. It's wonderful to see you all. Definitely feel free to turn on your cameras. We do have some interaction built in today. And as always, as you know from our webinars and workshops, we definitely want to hear from you. So any questions, do feel free to either raise your hand and we'll call on you, or just unmute. It's not a huge group, so that wouldn't be too distracting if you did that. So today we're talking about transforming behavior through restorative practices. All right, and here's our agenda. So we'll just start off with a couple of introductions, and then we'll go through our objectives. We'll talk about restorative practices in our schools today, in our communities, right? We'll talk about creating belonging and positive behaviors with a restorative lens. And then we'll have at the end a few high leverage practices that you can integrate into your community and your programs. I'm Lauren. This is Heather. It's nice to see you all. We've seen you many times, and we always look forward to getting together with our 21C folks. So thank you again for joining us. We know your schedules are busy. For those of you who have staff members that maybe wanted to attend or, are not able to be here this morning, maybe they're working in schools, right? This is recorded, so feel free to push this out to your folks. And then, of course, let us know, on the back end if you have any questions or you want to talk about a specific topic further, we'd be happy to do that. All right, so we're going to move into objectives. So today we'll understand the need for restorative practices in your programs, learn how these practices are effective in creating belonging and positive behaviors, and we'll explore some high leverage practices as well. All right, so we're going to start off with you. So Heather's actually going to post a link into the chat. So this is a Jamboard, and it's part of the Google Suite. You may or may not be familiar with this, but basically what will happen here is you'll go in, you have editing access. Anybody with a link has editing access. And so right here is a text box. So you're going to click the text box and type in. So what do you already know about restorative practices? What might you want to know? You can type in a question if you'd like. There's also a stick it note feature, so you could actually use a sticky note instead. So I'm actually going to escape from the PowerPoint, and I'll pull up the Jamboard here on my screen. So I should still be sharing if you can still see that. So this is the stick it note. You can click that and write in here. Or again, you can use the text box. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes. And again, tell me what you know, what you might want to know. And then we'll kind of talk about what you have to say here.
I did put that right in the chat.
Okay. Everyone's coming on in. Don't be shy. Great. Yeah, you can just stick these all over the board. It doesn't need to necessarily be right under the heading. The sides and the top or the bottom are fine too. Okay. Great. We'll move things around. So we might not know too much, may have heard of restorative practices. Yeah. Don't know what you don't know. How true is that? All right, I like it. How to help staff who are struggling with working through different situations. Yep, good. Improving behaviors for sure. We'll just take another minute here. Great, very good. All right, so we'll definitely talk about what restorative practices are. We'll talk a little bit about the origin in just a minute. We will talk about behavior. We'll talk about creating belonging, and then, through that, relationship building to improve behavior. Behavior is loaded, right? There's a lot to behavior, and this 60 minutes certainly won't tackle all of it. There's a lot more that we could talk about, different layers of behavior management and intervention that we could certainly talk about another time. Today, we'll use the restorative lens in terms of behavior, but yeah, for sure, there's a lot to talk about. And then helping staff. Just keep in mind that I know we did a staff SEL webinar a few weeks back at the beginning of October. Pretty much every strategy we end up talking about today and every single concept applies to your staff as well. So it applies to adults, it applies to students. And that's one of the nice things about restorative practices. They really are for all people. So I'm going to come right back over to the slideshow, and we're going to start with a little bit of background. So restorative practices are grounded in Indigenous teachings. So central to their philosophy was community. So, Indigenous people really felt that conflict affects all communities. And so this is really the origin of restorative practices. And if you think about conflict in your programs with your students, with staff and students, with staff and staff, right, it really does reverberate to all, right? And so that is sort of that thought about how, conflict really does affect everyone in the community. Restorative practices and restorative justice was actually introduced to the judicial system as a response to crime and wrongdoing back in the 1970s. And it really wasn't until about 20 years later where it actually appeared in schools. So it's kind of interesting that the school system, took a practice from the judicial system to reform behaviors in schools, but was very successful in the judicial system. So it actually in schools really originated in Australia and then moved through Europe, Canada, and eventually in the early, I would say mid 1990s to early 2000s came to the United States. And when it first came to the US, it was really intended to offer an alternative to exclusionary discipline. So if you've been in the education system for a while, or even if you remember when you were a student, zero tolerance became very, very popular in the 80s and the 90s. So essentially that was students are suspended and expelled, right? Zero tolerance, low threshold for behaviors, right? And so the option was to expel students. And what ended up happening is that there was really, we began to see this disproportionality with these suspensions and these expulsions. And it really became apparent in numbers of African-American students and students with disabilities. So the thought about restorative practices was that we need to bring these types of practices into our schools so that we can change that school to prison pipeline, and we can work with students that we have in our communities before we send them out. Today in New Hampshire, the discipline law has actually changed within the last year and a half, making it much harder, as you may know, to suspend students. So schools need to do a lot more intervention in terms of behavior and supports before they're able to suspend students. So you may see, some schools have different policies, but at the state level, they're really putting an eye on suspending and expelling students from schools and trying to move away from that. So in terms of the need for restorative practices, these types of practices really do, at their core, improve your school and your classroom culture. For you, it's your after school program culture within your individual groups that you have your activities at the different grade levels. These practices really do apply to all students in all grades. Restorative practices promote justice and equity. So not necessarily thinking about equality here, everyone has the same response, but an equitable response to behavior and to wrongdoing. So processing with students in terms of what they need and sort of thinking about, the behavior that has occurred and addressing it behavior by behavior, student by student, considering the other factors that the student brings to the table as well. These types of practices prioritize student agency. So student agency is a concept of student voice and student choice, right? So putting the student at the center of the work. The student has a lot of work to do in restorative practices in terms of processing behavior and making things right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. These practices are important because it really does focus on the person rather than like the character of a person, right? Somebody being a bad student, someone's being naughty, right? This really focuses on the actual behavior, right? So this student was non-compliant. This student assaulted another student. So we're focusing on behavior versus the character of a person, which is really, really important to keep in mind. Again, an emphasis, and if you've been with us before and lately, especially, we've been talking a lot about social emotional learning. So these types of practices really do place emphasis on developing and strengthening explicit social emotional learning skills. So when we're explicit, there's an intention behind what we're teaching students. We're recognizing a need, like a need in self-awareness, for example, and we're explicitly teaching students how to develop skills in self-awareness. Restorative practices really do emulate kindness and empathy, mutual respect, and a sense of trust, right? And the notion of relationship is really foundational. And so we'll talk a lot about relationships this morning in your programs. Great. So these are the 5 R's of restorative practices, right? So we want to keep these in mind when we're thinking about different practices. So repair, the person who causes harm is expected to repair it. And there's a facilitation that needs to go along with that. And us as adults need to help students through this repair process, right? So we're going to teach them how to repair. And the couple of strategies that we'll talk about in a little bit will help us do that with some very pointed questions and like processing conversations to have with our students. Reintegration. So this really encourages the collaboration of the community and the person who caused harm, rather than isolating a person and rather than, again, suspending or expelling a person, removing a person from a program, for example. So if there's something that happens in an after-school activity in a group, right, the reintegration piece means that we want the wrongdoer to work to be reintegrated back into that environment. So they may do this by way of having conversations with the other students. They may do this by way of having a meeting with their families and you all as leaders in your programs to reintegrate back into the after school environment, right? Again, relationships are essential here and foundational. And we really are talking about the fact that relationships can heal between students and staff, or even again, between staff and staff, once the person, so the wrongdoer, let's say, takes responsibility and accountability for their actions. So that's really important. Respect, keeping the process respectful, safe, and that mutual sense of, I'm going to listen, I'm going to speak, I'm going to listen, I will be listened to. That mutual respect is really paramount here. And then again, responsibility, we've talked a little bit about that. And understanding that responsibility really is a personal choice. And we really do want students to understand the impact of their behavior on a situation and or their behavior on other people. And so again, that kind of comes back to the social emotional learning of that self-awareness and self-management. So we're going to tie back in some of the things we've talked about in some of our previous work together. So we'll talk a little bit here about belonging and positive behaviors. We'll talk a little bit about management here as well. So this is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You may have seen this slide before. I actually showed it at an SEL component of our workshop in June. But this is really important to have a foundational understanding of our students' needs, right? Our needs as humans, but especially our students that we see after their very long school days, right? We see them every single day or most days during the week. And we really want to keep this model in the back of our minds. So very foundationally, we need to satisfy our students' psychological needs, physiological needs, excuse me, and psychological too, but physiological needs in terms of, food, shelter, clothing, sleep. We know our students need these. We know that our students get some of these needs met at school, right? And some of our students are actually attending after school programs. It lengthens their school day, because we know it may be a safer place to be than actually at home, right? So we see students in our after school programs for a variety of needs. I know you have different requirements within your programs, different allowances, but a lot of our students we do see, filling this very basic need during school or after school. That safety and security piece, we want our students to feel like they're safe in our programs after school. Our programs after school are predictable for students. They know what to expect when they get there. In terms of this love and belonging, we want to create friendships among our students. We want to create healthy relationships between our staff and our students. Right? We want our students to feel a sense of connection. Sometimes this may feel challenging because you may have students just 1 or 2 days a week, right? But I do believe that through your intentional planning, you can provide that, you can satisfy that need for students within your program, even if they do attend 1 day a week, right? So thinking about making sure we're creating that sense of connection for students and belonging. Self-esteem, right? We want to encourage students to achieve their best. We want students to be confident. We want to provide opportunities for them where they can be successful and they can feel a sense of accomplishment and confidence when they're working through content, especially if it's after school help in subject areas that are really difficult for students, right? We really want to develop this sense of self-esteem. And this very top of this triangle is this idea of self-actualization, which really could take a lifetime to achieve, I guess, if we really want to go get into the nitty-gritty of it. But in terms of students in our programming, right, we want to think about students meeting their potential, right? And being accepted and feeling like they do belong and they're able to, they believe in themselves, right? They're able to produce the work we want them to produce and be successful in school and in their relationships as well. So when we think about all of that with learning and school and being successful on the academic side, this is just, again, we take Maslow's hierarchy of needs and we just put it in a triangle that has to do with schools, school settings, after school settings. And again, we touched upon this physiological need of your environment being safe and predictable for students. It has to be. The environments in your programs must be inclusive, right? And again, we must strengthen the social emotional competence of our students and our staff, but certainly our students to really increase their sense of belonging. And once they're feeling like they belong, like they're capable, they are available, students are available to access content. And what that means is students can do work, academic work, when all of these other needs are met, right? When they are emotionally in a good place, students can do academic work. And really, we want them to be their best selves, right? So this is really important to keep in mind as you're programming and you're thinking about these different strategies that you may want to bring into your program. You want to keep this triangle in mind, right? In terms of management, there was a couple of comments about managing student behavior, and there's a couple of thoughts here that we'll go through, and I'm hoping that this resonates with folks. So we want to personally train our staff to use a management style that honors relationships. And when I say that, I mean, we need to be firm with students. We need to be fair with students. We need to have high expectations of our students, but we can do that in a way that still honors our relationship with them, right? We can be friendly when we're disciplining students, right? It doesn't have to be harsh we can still be, we can be firm and we can be friendly at the same exact time, okay? One concept I want to talk about, and I'm going to show you an image in just a minute, but I want you to think about combining high control and high support when we're working with students. And that will make a little bit more sense in just a second. So when we provide a high control and high support, we're helping students work through situations, and we're solving problems with students and doing things with our students versus doing things for our students or doing things to our students, right? So it's this concept of with. We're increasing, and I'll show you the social discipline window in just a second. Actually, it might make sense as we're talking about it. I'm going to actually toggle forward and then I'm going to come back. So this is the social discipline window. And so this is if we provide a high control for students in a situation, but not a lot of support of how to navigate through a situation, we may end up with a punitive response for students. If we do not control a situation well, and we do not support a student through a behavior situation, we may become negligent, right? Or neglectful in a situation. When we provide too much support, right, we may be permissive, right? We may do things for students, too much for students. But when we work to help students navigate through situations together and we work with them, we take a more restorative approach. So this is, again, it's called the social discipline window. We want to make sure that in our management style, we're intentionally embedding relationships, right? An opportunity for relationship building into your practices and using consequences that are logical. So logical consequences really should be consequences that are related to a behavior, right? Oftentimes, I've seen in schools, we take things away from kids, but we don't necessarily take things away from kids that are related to a behavior, right? So let's say in an art class or in an after-school session that you're running, a student is misusing paints, right? You're working on an art project and a student is misusing the paint. From a restorative lens with a logical consequence, you're going to change the medium for the student. You may offer a student a colored pencil. You may offer a student a crayon, right? And you may say, I'm sorry, you're not able to use paints today because you're not using them appropriately. That would be an example of a logical consequence. And technically that would be a loss of a privilege, right? The privilege is paint. We're working on paint with paints. It's exciting. It's fun. Painting is a blast, but you're not able to handle it because you're painting all over my table. There's paint on the floor around you. You need to use something else, right? So that's an example of a logical consequence. Another consequence that makes sense for students and that you actually can use, I'm going to use a K-8 lens here, is a positive timeout. So that's dedicating a timeout space within your program environment that doesn't remove a student from your classroom or your after school space. It doesn't punitively put a student out in the hallway by him or herself. It's an opportunity in your classroom to have the student there, perhaps still listening, but taking a break from maybe something that the larger group is doing, right? Maybe the student isn't sitting still, maybe the student is blurting out. So that's an example of a positive timeout. And then break it, fix it is fairly self-explanatory for material things, right? You're going to work to fix something that you've broken, but you can also use this concept with peers as well. So if you harm a relationship, you fix the relationship. And that really is, in essence, what we're talking about today with restorative practices. So I have some strategies in just a few minutes that hone in a little bit on the relationships that have been damaged, the break it, fix it. So we'll talk through that. Again, there's your social discipline window. We just spent a couple of minutes talking about that. Affective language. This is really, really important. Adult language is paramount. I think, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I sometimes felt when I was working in the schools that I didn't have control of a ton. Sometimes it doesn't feel like our staff they feel perhaps that they don't have a lot of control. But one thing that we always will have control of as educators and folks who support students is our own language. We always have control of what comes out of our mouth, right? So we want to think about using effective language with students. We want to think about your staff using effective language, and effective language expresses feeling. So again, we're honing in on that SEL component. We're tapping into feelings and emotions. Effective language will reflect care and concern. Okay. Effective language separates, as does restorative practice, the deed from the doer. Again, we're looking at an undesirable behavior versus an undesirable student, right? Effective language is authentic as you can be when you're so frustrated and so upset, which we know can happen, right? And effective language helps to remind students of expectations. It helps to redirect students to expectations and then reinforce expectations as well. So you have some examples, and I'm going to just let you read these. I won't read them all to you, but you see some examples of perhaps a typical response that we might have on the left side of this chart. And then there's an example on the right of an affective response instead of a typical response. These types of responses may not always feel very natural. Sometimes we have to work at this. We have to make a decision and we have to say, I'm working on my effective language this month, right? Or this week, or today, I'm going to work on, intentionally using effective language with my students today after school. And it does take some practice, right? It really does take some practice, because it's faster to say, put your phone away. It's faster to say, knock it off, right? But it doesn't hone in on feeling. It doesn't come back to relationship. It doesn't come back to, creating an environment for students that potentially, fosters belonging and nurturing. And so that's really the lens that, we're thinking about for restorative practice. So I encourage you to try this even on your own. You could give it a whirl with your staff members, right? Or you can, start it with your students. But I definitely think that it takes practice, even though it looks so basic in a sentence. I feel uncomfortable when I hear you teasing, right? But it does take a little bit of practice. All right, so your turn. I'm hoping that you'll unmute and or you're welcome to use the chat as well. But I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. So, what are some management moves that you make with students that honor relationships? In your programs, in your work, day-to-day work with kiddos, what are some moves that you make that honor relationships? Feel free to unmute. Feel free to use the chat.
I don't know if this plays into it, but like I have kind of like a swearing policy with my middle school kids, where I put the expectation on myself by saying that if I'm not allowed to swear here, neither are you, and I kind of give the opportunity where I said, hey, if you hear me swearing, then, we can open up the possibility for you guys, but I've developed a filter to do that. And that's something that you guys need to develop as well, so the kids tend to like respect that, that I'm not just like saying something and then doing something else. So they actually like just see that I'm also including myself, in that expectation.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Jake. Great example. What else do you all do? I know you do a lot.
So I'm Kelsey, and so one thing that I like to do is I use the VAR method, which is validating, appreciating, and referring students. So when they go to me, maybe they're feeling upset with a friend, I will validate them and appreciate them for coming and talking to me, and I'll refer them to some supports. Depending on the situation, it could be like, an actual, like, it could be a counselor, it could be like, maybe it could be referring them to use like a fidget if that's helpful for them, or it could be about referring them to talk to their friend and referring them to a way that could kind of restore the relationship.
Great. When you do that, do you have a specific like protocol that you use with students?
Yeah, so I will kind of talk with them one-on-one, and I will first like thank them for talking to me, and I'll validate them, like how they're feeling, and let them know, you know, whether they're angry or sad, you know, their feelings are valid,
Right.
and then I'll try to find the best like referring like method of
Right.
what
Yeah.
type of supports do they need.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. That's great, Kelsey. Thank you. What else do you do? Some management moves you make.
I do, I have a lot of kids who do have some disabilities, even on the spectrum kind of thing. So they get easily distracted or can't focus. And so I let them take a, you know, like, let's take a walk. You know, I said, you're getting yourself upset. Let's go take a walk. And we kind of talk about it. And by the time we're done the walk, or they're kind of just de-escalating while they're walking and talking.
Great. Great. Thank you. Anybody else for this one?
There's a couple in the chat here
Great.
too. Yeah.
Heather, can you read those? Because I can't quite
Yeah.
pull up the chat.
Well, it's funny. I think it might be going because you're the host. It might be going behind because the same thing happened to me.
Gotcha.
So basically, Maggie said that making time to greet each student as they arrive is something that's really important.
Mhm.
Gail was saying using students' name and telling students that you want to hear what they have to say, and then requesting they wait a moment or designate a time to talk further if they need to talk further. Alex said when students are having an issue, I always make sure that they're heard and that we together will find a solution. And then Alexis said she likes to visit each of her after-school program groups and see what they're working on and acknowledging their hard work and making sure to greet students and learning each of their names and personalities. She says it helps me get to know each student better and to better manage their issues that occur during the programming.
Yeah, for sure. I think getting to know your students, and some of you have so many sites, right? But that really is key, right? And we can manage a lot more efficiently when we really do know our students. Thank you. How do you manage support and control while maintaining student agency? So we talked a little bit about student agency being student choice and student voice. So, you know, how are you effective in your management with students while keeping their voice and choice sort of at the forefront? We talked a little bit, somebody mentioned the VAR protocol, which is great. Getting to know students, that helps too. What else do you think? How do your students have choice?
I tend to give my kids like multiple choices for each of our activity blocks, whether it's like our academic time, like instead of only doing one thing, they have like the option of two, you know, so at least they have some, so they don't feel locked into something.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so if they have homework, they do homework. If they don't have homework, you know, they'll do an online tutoring thing with us. You know, same thing with like the enrichment activities that we do. There's like a choice that they can freely choose which one they want to do, you know, versus them being locked into something. As well as just giving lots of opportunities every day during our afternoon meeting for any input on activities that they would like to do, you know, or in most cases, like they don't say anything, but the opportunity is there.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that's great. I think affording them an opportunity to weigh in and give feedback is really important. Right. And again, that all feeds back into a sense of belonging and connection into your program. Right. And so when you have that, hopefully, you'll start to experience less behavior. I'm not saying it all disappears for sure, but it is certainly helpful. Any other thoughts about student agency in your programs? And then finally, thinking about the social discipline window, we just talked a little bit about some choice in your activities, but what else do you think you can do with students? Think about it. Maybe you haven't done it yet. What can you do with your students instead of to or for them? Think about that. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that. Things that you think you can do with them instead of to or for them.
We always incorporate students as we plan the day. We may be kind of guiding them into what we're planning, but we do that. We do it with rules and expectations for playground, for classrooms, for gym. We meet, depending on the grade level, we meet at least once a day as a group. Some schools meet twice a day as a group and just chat things through. Whether it's announcing the choices for the next activity and explaining what each is about. We ask students what they like, what they don't like. I really like this statement with instead of to or for, and I want to bring that to staff. But I think we do a decent job at it, but I'm sure we can do better.
Great. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thanks for sharing. Any other thoughts on the with? There might be something in the chat, Heather.
Yep, it just came up that they have a student advisory. Anne Marie was saying they have student advisory and ask them for what they want to see next, etc.
I love that. I think, and I was actually thinking about that earlier today too. I've just been thinking a lot about your programs and how different they are and how to, as I was pulling these practices together, it's like, how can you implement them with, there's so many variables for your programs. But I was actually thinking about that, student advisory, that concept of a student advisory or student voice groups where you change the students out, whether it's on a quarterly basis or whatever. And the intent would be to get as many students involved as you possibly can in that decision making about your program, and getting feedback from them, is really invaluable. So great idea. Thanks for bringing that up. Good job. All right, let's move into this last section here in terms of some restorative practices that you can integrate into your community. And again, you know your after school community the best. And so sometimes I'll hear some pushback from folks and they say, this is just too big, it's too much, there's no buy-in, no, and it's not that people don't want to do restorative practices, it's just that it feels like it's a really, really big concept, and how do you bring that in? And when we train teachers and schools on this, it can feel really, really big. And for you all, you're unique because you're connected to schools, you're an extension of the school day. So my thought is really to start small and to try not to be overwhelmed by restorative practices as this big thing that you must implement all of these practices, right? I would encourage you to think about one strategy to integrate and push that out to your staff. As the leader, feel really confident yourself. And if you have questions, of course, Heather and I can help you, right? But feeling confident about something or change you can make, one change, start small, right? You start small, you go slow to go fast, right? In theory. So we work on one thing, and then you can add on and layer other things into your programs, right? I think prioritizing these practices and this idea of belonging and connection and relationships really will become part of your culture, right? The more that you choose to do that focuses on these things and those three areas, the more it becomes part of your culture. And the way your students know how you operate and they know what's expected, right? In terms of perhaps responses to behavior, right? They will come to know how you expect them to process behavioral incidents that occur, right? So it becomes known to students. And again, we add on slowly and thoughtfully as you go.
Just a quick question, Lauren, when you say, like, if you're on the slide before this, if you say pick one thing, is there one thing that you feel like is something that would be doable, or is it really sort of take a peek at your program and figure out what would be a good strategy to start with?
I think all of these strategies that we're going to talk about in just a second are potentially doable, but if you feel like you have a lot of conflict with students, right, you may choose to start with the restorative conversation, right? That may be something, and I'll show you in just a minute. There's 5 processing questions for that. You may say, you know, this month or this quarter of the year, I'm really going to focus on restorative conversations with students so they come to know what to expect when they have a conflict. So that would be something. So it really, I do think, does depend on your program, but that would be one thing that you could implement that I think would be fairly easy to implement. All right, so in June, we did talk about community agreements, and I felt it necessary to bring this back today because it really is a restorative practice. And I know not everybody was with us in June too, so that's why I wanted it to be part of this as well. But community agreements are statements that really describe the environment that we want to work on, and they're co-created by students and by adults. So I know you have, many of you have your program expectations, right? And so this is really an opportunity when you're creating agreements to use those foundations as a guide, but to get some student input in developing what becomes an agreement between students and staff, right? When we have these agreements, we are able to refer to them each day in your program, right? Some of you do an opening meeting. That would be a time you would refer to a community agreement. And community agreements will serve as a reference point for your interaction. So Jake actually kind of alluded to it with the swearing, right? So the expectation is that students don't swear and that staff don't swear, right? So we use kind and respectful language in our program. That's an example of a community agreement, right? So it's not, I don't swear, we don't swear, right? But it's taking that concept and just making an agreement between staff and students about it, right? That's something that's important to Jake in terms of his programming. So it's just an opportunity to, you know, use that kind of, that language in terms of making an agreement that you're both parties are kind of involved in developing, right? Something that's important. So that would be an example of that. So traditional rules, right? Don't do this, don't do that. They focus on compliance. So a community agreement will focus on engagement and belonging versus compliance, right? And so an example of that would be we help peers when they are struggling. So you can see this right-hand column of examples of agreements, right? Again, the traditional lens is like a non-negotiable for safety, right? So in the community agreement lens, that restorative lens, we do include non-negotiables because we have to have safety at the forefront of what we do with students, right, of our programs, but it does focus on growth, right? We take responsibility. We know we're going to make mistakes. We take responsibility for them and we make a plan to improve, right? Traditional rules are created by adults and agreements are created by students and adults, okay? And the agreement folds the adult in as well as a member of the community. It's not just for kids, it's for everybody to follow. School rules, traditional agreements, school rules and behaviors, traditional rules, and then agreements is based more on values. So like we just talked about with Jake's example, sorry, Jake, I'm bringing you up again, but that kind language in the classroom community, right? We value that. We value kind and respectful language. So we're not going to say we don't swear or don't swear, right? But we're going to frame it to reflect a value, right? Versus just a rule, because it is a value. And then the traditional lens focuses on managing disruptive behavior, and the community agreement focuses on a positive learning habit. Okay, so those are some of the differences between that traditional paradigm and then the restorative paradigm and the community agreement. So if we had more time, I would have you listing some rules that you might have and how you can make agreements, but we don't have that time today, but I'm always happy to chat more about these. Again, it's the essence of self-discipline because kids are involved, right? And it really helps keep people on track. We have our student voice coming back in here. I've mentioned it a few times. It's really important to your programming. It's important during their school day as well. Some may be afforded more of an opportunity for choice and voice versus others, right? It really depends on their teachers and their classroom culture and what's expected there too. But you might be able to make that change in your after school program. This type of agreement delivers this message that you care about students, you care what they have to say, you're in it together, and you follow these agreements just like they do. The idea of a regulation space, I'm not sure how many folks have this. This may be a calming corner, a Zen den. You may have lots of different names for it, but it's really intentional in design. And I want to show you what I mean by that in just a second. So this regulation space that I'm going to talk to you about provides an opportunity for de-escalation, right? And to have students refocus. It's used after we remember that affective language that we talked about. We would offer this opportunity up for students after we've reminded them, after we've redirected them about expected behaviors, and they're still struggling, right? They really need to regulate. They need to refocus. They need to calm their bodies and their minds, right? So this is where we would use this. This is, again, intentional, and it's designed to help students identify their feelings and choose a strategy to help calm their bodies and essentially get back to learning, right? That's really the end goal, is that we want our kids back to learning, whether it's in their homework time or their activity time that they're in, we want them back. This space offers kiddos an opportunity to take a break, but not be isolated, right? And I did touch upon that a little bit before in that positive time out, right? So this allows kids to stay connected. It also acknowledges where kids are at, right? It acknowledges feelings, it acknowledges that students struggling, and it also sends the message like, it's okay, right? And here's this opportunity for you to work through that, okay? Again, this offers a high control and a high support. So it's restorative in nature, it's predictable, and we have our students work toward independence in this type of setting. So this is taken from conscious discipline, okay? And so technically speaking, and you have, obviously you have autonomy to move these things around, but in this regulation room, or this regulation space idea, you focus on 5 steps for students, right? And the first step is I am. So, what happens? I am mad, right? I am furious. I am so sad, right? Why? And then it offers the students an opportunity to calm. So you would provide students, and I have some visual examples for you in just a second. You'd provide some students an opportunity to choose a couple of ways to calm down, okay? How do students feel after they've had an opportunity to calm down? Again, acknowledgement of feelings. So I feel this way. I'm employing this strategy to calm my body. How do I feel now? And then, again, if there's an activity that they want to do, you have them doing some yoga in a rocking chair. If they're anything that you have, like in a bin, some rice, some poppets, somebody mentioned a fidget earlier. So there's different types of strategies here and things you can offer students to get their bodies back under control in their minds, and then offer them an opportunity to solve what's next. So they can reflect on the situation. If they've made something wrong with a friend, they can make it right with a friend. something to fix it or to at the last here to solve, maybe finishing their work. Like, what do you have to do next, essentially? So I have a handout for you. It's a couple of pages, actually. And so it's very in depth. This is sort of just, again, we have 60 minutes together. This is like at 30,000 feet. But again, it's an intentional space for processing with your students. It's not a space that is simply, sit and read a book or sit on the couch or a beanbag. I'm not saying that's bad, but this is an offering to kind of follow steps, right, to work through feelings and regulation in a predictable way, right? So these are some examples, and I would have made them bigger, but the images are not great. But what I like about these is that they're very explicit. So in this type of space in your program, it's explicit in terms of I am feeling, and there's an opportunity to identify feelings. What can I do to calm my body down, right? So there is very intentional. There's images because we have younger students. There's words. We may have words with our older students. So it's intentionally designed, right? And it's explicit in terms of what we want students to do when they're there. I alluded to a restorative conversation a few minutes ago when Heather asked about a practice to implement. This is a one-on-one dialogue between a student and a teacher. This also could be used student to student. However, it's most likely going to be facilitated by an adult, right? It should happen in private, not in front of a class. And this conversation is intended to get to the root of behavior and for students to be able to make it right. These types of conversations should really be timely. You're not necessarily going to have this type of conversation a couple of days later. It really should be more in the moment. But I do recognize that if you have a really extreme behavior, like you've got a student flipping desks or tables, right? Throwing scissors, hitting somebody with the scissors, like there may be a time where somebody else needs to help you, right? And somebody else needs to come in and support that student as well. You may not be able to do this in that moment. This is probably more productive for something on the smaller scale that you can address pretty much right away, okay? And again, we're not focusing on a punishment here. We're focusing more on a process to make things right. And so there's a little handout on a lot of these slides for you so that there's further information here for you. But these are the 5 processing questions. I'll just give you a second to look at those. So again, this could be a strategy that you choose to use, you train your staff on, and together your staff, you brainstorm a list of possible scenarios where something like this might be really helpful, right? And so you commit to employing this strategy first, right? This is an easier one to kind of get going and get in the mix. Peer conflict and mediation. Some schools have peer conflict or peer mediation programs. And so this is really allowing students to kind of take a lead in terms of helping their peers negotiate conflict. This might be something nice for your upper elementary and middle school students to try. Again, adults have to help facilitate this, but this is, again, something that gives kids a lot more voice, a lot more autonomy, right? So this is something to consider. Again, it's in your handout for you, but you're going to think about structuring this, right? And so every time you would try this strategy, you would do the same things. You have your ground rules. Those are going to be set prior to any of this work. You explore the issues with students. You generate possible solutions. You choose how the student chooses a solution, and then the student writes an agreement, all right, about what he or she is going to choose to resolve the situation. It's worth saying that sometimes you have to come back to the table because sometimes things change, right? Or sometimes a solution that you think is going to work doesn't work. So you have to come back to the table with the student again, all right, and choose a different solution. A problem-solving conference, again, these are just different ways to work with kids, right? You don't have to do all of them. You can pick and choose. This might address a specific problem that a child is having in your program. And this one really is student and staff, right? So this invites the student into the conversation to help work on a solution. You know, we may say the student isn't following directions, like habitually is not following directions, right? Habitually is off task. Those two might be examples of when you might have a problem-solving conference. And the big piece of those is, right, it's impacting their progress and their learning. So you may choose to have a problem-solving conference with those students, again, to help them kind of see the impact of the behavior, offering the kiddos an opportunity to say, well, what do you notice about this? Getting their feedback again and generating some alternatives, right? Again, we choose a strategy, we make an agreement. So we have some similarities. You can read through these and see, which resonates with you in terms of what you might like to try. Community circle, we have talked about this in terms of community meetings. It's really important to bring this up again because some of you start your programs with meetings, but a circle really is an opportunity for students to be seen and heard and known. And we think about circles they're very significant, right? Because without any one section of the circle, it's not a circle. And so you can't see everybody, right? And not everybody's included, right? If we break our circle. So it's really important that we consider using this shape intentionally when we meet with students. In this circle, we can have our community meetings, right? The getting to know you meetings that are perhaps intentional that you start your program with. However, we can also use the circle in a progression in more of a restorative lens, right? So we can use this community circle when we have a problem. We could use this community circle with your grade 5 group because they're really struggling, they're bickering, they're using unkind language to one another. You may be able to use a circle, right, to help you resolve a conflict with a group that you have, perhaps a larger group. You can also use the circle to restore conflict with a smaller group, like 3 to 5 students, for example. It could be a very small group that the problem may be impacting just a couple of your students. Not a great impact, just a smaller impact. So you could use the circle, this theory. And so it helps if you have some knowledge, your students have some knowledge of community meetings, which most elementary do in the form of their morning meeting, even first thing in the day. But it's also helpful if you do that in your program as well. So that it feels a little bit more natural to come back when you have a problem, right? We already know we meet, we get to know you, we meet for those reasons, but we can also come back into this same setting when something's not working for us, okay? I know it's 11:30. This is my last 2 slides right here. But these are just some considerations for you as adults, as facilitators. It's important for you to participate in the circle just as much, right? You want to invite your students' experiences in. When you have a problem with your class and you're using this in a restorative lens, you want to make sure that you have planned ahead in terms of kind of how you're hoping to facilitate the dialogue, but also be flexible with students that they may bring the conversation in a slightly different direction because something else may be concerning to them that they feel like they need addressed. So we want to make sure we plan for circle, but we also want to go back to that idea about our management thought about being flexible, right? So make sure that you're keeping that flexibility piece in mind with your circle as well. This is just a breakdown for you of minutes potentially. Again, you could use these minutes for an opening circle. You can use this breakdown for a restorative circle. We don't have time today for this, and I didn't plan on showing you anyway today, but I wanted to let you know there's a link here on the next slide of a restorative circle. So you could watch that just to get some ideas and how you could use that in your program. Okay. Again, there's handouts for you in that. So tomorrow you're going to get I think it's within 24 hours, you're going to get this slide deck with these links. You're also going to get a folder with handouts. Okay. And so you have viewing access to all these handouts and sort of these protocols to these conversations, or the regulation space, the agreements, and then again, this circle as well. So, keeping in mind, restorative practices are for everybody, not just students, they're for your staff as well. And circling back, I think we answered quite a bit of questions. Again, behavior is a loaded topic. So if you have some specific questions, I'm happy to hang on with you. Or if you feel like you want more training around behavior, let us know, because we can certainly prep that for you as well. And just one thought, I won't ask you to unmute because I know we're at 11:32, so I'm going to wrap. But I would love for you to think about one shift you might be able to make in your program based on this information from today. Whether it's a small shift or a large shift, I'd love to, maybe in your feedback, in your survey feedback that comes in, I'd love to know maybe one shift that you'd like to make. So any questions, Heather, in the chat?
Yeah, sorry. Earlier, Gail was just asking when you were talking about that designation space and all of that, that is there a specific person that you have that is designated to that area, or is it something that you train your students so that they can do that independently? Just wondering in general about how you implement that within the programs.
That's a great question. So you could actually do it either way. Let me speak to both ways. So many classrooms have these regulation spaces in their own individual classrooms in school buildings. You could have, it depends on what your setup is with your room availability. You could have that in, like, if you have a third grade room or whatever it is, you could have it in a room. You could also decide that because you have programs using a lot of different spaces in your after school, in your setting, you may have one space. You may have one space that you choose that you can have a staff member dedicated to coaching students through that process. So it could actually be used both ways, Gail. It can be used in the individual space. It could be used in a more general space. If it's in a more general space, you could also consider creating a bucket that travels. So you may not be able to put things on the wall that stay there permanently, but you could have a makeshift. And if you want to hang on, we could talk about this a little bit more, but you can take all those necessary components and you could have them in a tote, right? And students could even take it with them. So that also happens in classrooms. Some kiddos have regulation totes. So there's a lot of different ways to be creative with how to embed this. One of the main things is that it becomes predictable wherever you choose to implement it. The process for students to get back to learning becomes predictable, if that makes sense, in terms of the identification of the feelings, the calm down strategy, and then getting back to learning, maybe solving the problem. And coming back to your activity. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. As you sign off, the survey should pop up for you. Would love to get your feedback. And again, if there's any other behavior things that you would like to hone in on for your staff, I'm happy to talk about that too. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.